and welcome! Today I want to talk about one of my favourite things, generally, and that is alternative history. There is a wealth of material in pop culture dealing with the idea of parallel universes, alternative timelines, whether it's the first example that I came across when I was reading, The Man in the High Castle, that's of course now become a very fancy Amazon TV series, to perhaps one of the most famous examples, the Star Trek Mirror Universe. I'm instantly regretting duct taping this beard to my goatee. Ow, ow, ow. Okay. In terms of material that's available out there, there is a wealth of options, whether it's literature, the excellent books of Harry Turtledove, whether it's his World War series, his alternative Civil War series, Great War series, or this, which I heartily recommend, Ruled Britannia, or in the world of comics, where of course we've got DC's Elseworlds line, which I love, and of course perhaps one of the most famous examples in comics, Marvel's What If, which has now become a cartoon series on Disney+, but long before it was an animated series, it was of course an ongoing series in the regular trade paperback issues, where they would simply take an element of story relating to one of the major characters from the Marvel Universe and then change one facet of it and ask themselves, what if Aunt May had died instead of Uncle Ben? What if Captain America had never been frozen? You get the general idea. Now this has spilled over into the cinematic universe. We've had the amazing Captain Carter, who appeared in the recent Doctor Strange movie. What I feel is sadly lacking, though, is Warhammer examples of what if. So this is something that regularly occupies my brain when I'm not otherwise dealing with square bases or reading through old white dwarfs. What if, for example, there had been an alternative version of the Horus Heresy? What if Vlad von Carstein had won the War of the Vampire Counts? There are lots of awesome questions that, given Games Workshop's been around for basically 40 years by this point, it surprises me that they've not yet covered that themselves, whether it's in the form of an article in White Dwarf or, for example, some Black Library novels. I'd love to see. I know we're coming to the end eventually when Dan Abnett decides how many books is going to be in the last series. We're coming to the end of the Horus Heresy novels, which seems like it's prime time to launch a new series of Horus Heresy novels set in an alternative universe. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is going to be an ongoing series of videos in which I'm going to pose the question, what if? And then I'm going to give you my own personal take on it in terms of how it's spun out in my brain. If you'd like to participate in this, I'll be regularly posting pictures of my projects that I'm doing in relation to this up on Twitter, on Blue Sky, all the other Instagram, etc. type social medias. And if you join my Patreon and you want to submit your own entries for this, then I will feature those in future videos. Today, though, I want to ask you a question. Two questions, really. What if there was an alternative version of the Horus Heresy, and what would it look like? Now, before you start, I know, Dornian Heresy. I could just sit here and give you an entire video about the Dornian Heresy. If you don't know what the Dornian Heresy is, well, Google it. But there are a whole host of videos out there that have already been done on that subject, and I don't feel like it's my place really to just regurgitate somebody else's alternative history of the Horus Heresy, albeit it is very cool, and I'm just going to have to mention briefly, so Dornian Heresy was essentially done on the Bolter and Chainswords forums a few years ago, and they asked the question, what if Dorn had become the traitor that founded the Horus Heresy, and what would that have looked like? It's cool, it's not necessarily how I would go about it. What we're going to deal with is how I would go about it. So, in this series, we're going to look at it essentially as a proper mirror universe version of the Horus Heresy. So there could be versions where you say, okay, well, what if this legion remained loyal, but this legion turned traitor? What if, you know, for example, the Sons of Horus and the Blood Angels and the Ultramarines all teamed up and took on the rest of the universe? I'm going to do a straight flip, reflected in the mirror version of it. Good to bad. What if it was noble became monstrous, and what if what was monstrous had within it the spirit of nobility? To that end, I'm going to deal with a couple of legions in each video. I'm going to paint up a model for each of my alternative legions, or descended chapters where they've remained loyal thereof. And over the course of it, I will also just spill out my own thoughts and ideas as to what an alternative what-if version of the Horus Heresy could look like, albeit it's of course not the Horus Heresy. So, two legions we're going to deal with today. First one I want to deal with is really, I suppose, an homage to the Dornian heresy, and it's this, the Imperial Fists. I want to ask the question, what if Rogel Dorn had to endure some of the trials and the tribulations that were borne by his brother Primarchs, who frankly did not have it as easy as some of the others? So I suppose first of all we have to just kind of establish what the background for Rogel Dorn is. Rogel Dorn, of course, landed on the planet of Inwit. There he founded an already star-spanning galactic empire, albeit not as big as Reboot Guilliman's, because I guess they've got to do things slightly differently. Was found by the Emperor, instantly became one of the Emperor's favourite sons, and then went around being big and gold and stern and bold and generally with a stick up his butt. What I want to ask is this: what if things had not been quite so easy for Rogel Dorn? So let's consider the character of the man that we're dealing with first. Rogel Dorn is famously attributed to have said, "Discipline, duty, unyielding will, these are the measures by which every warrior is judged. Unarmed, a warrior with these qualities will still find victory, no matter how long or arduous the path. When girded with the sacred armaments of the Adeptus Astartes, such a warrior becomes truly indomitable." Bold words, a strong spirit to stand behind. Look, as long as you are tough and disciplined and work hard and don't eat avocado on toast, then everything will be fine. Rogel Dorn landed on the planet Inwit, which is a death world. I mean, there's no two ways around it. Almost every Primarch, save perhaps Bobby G, landed on a death world and had to endure unimaginable hardships as a youth before they were found by whatever humans lived there and raised as their own. Inwit is a planet that orbits around a dying red star. It's got very little in the way of energy or warmth or heat. It's tidally locked, so one side is permanently facing out into the darkness and cold of space. The other side, even that, is so weakly warmed by its sun that it's permanently under ice. The seas are turgid and buried under thick layers of ice sheet, and the humans that live on that world, aside from hunting what little life forms live on the surface, remain within massive ice hives where they controlled an empire that they had already established, because the other thing they had going for them was a massive orbital shipyard with the derelict remains of innumerable ships from over the millennia scattered around the system, which they could cannibalize and repair and reform and use to go forth and kick the snot out of all the other human planets that perhaps weren't so fortunate as to have giant orbital shipyards. From there, therefore, they were then able to support themselves on this otherwise near barren world of Inwit and ruled their kind of mini galactic empire until such time as the Emperor of Mankind came along, gave them the tap, and they were then included in the wider human Imperium. What if things had not been quite so? What if you take away that orbital shipyard? So here's my scenario. The young youth who would become known as Rogel of the Clan Dawn crashed into the icy surface of the planet Inwit and was soon found by hunters and gatherers that roamed the surface and taken back to the stronghold of the Clan of Dawn, where he was immediately recognised as a valuable resource, if nothing else. A powerful and potent youth. He was adopted by the patriarch of one of the clans, who, being too old to be a father figure to the young Rogel, instead became a sort of adoptive grandfather. So far, so good. The Clan of Dawn, the ruling clan of Inwit, and the various other clans of Inwit were in the process of establishing their star-spanning empire based upon the might of the orbital shipyards that they had and the other kind of potent starships, including the mega Ramillies-class fortress that would come to be known as the Phalanx, that was located in orbit around the planet of Inwit. That's until the Iron Cage, as it would come to be known. The Iron Cage was a massive space hulk that, perhaps caught in the warp wake of the young infant Rogel's journey through space and time by the forces of the Chaos Gods, followed him out of the ether and into real space around the planet of Inwit, where it barreled through the orbital shipyards and wreckage of the numerous spaceships that were there in orbit, tearing them apart before eventually ending its fiery plunge in a crash into the heart of the Ramillies-class starfort. It broke into 3 or 4 large chunks at that point, remaining essentially as huge, misshapen, radiation-filled moons now orbiting in a slowly decaying orbit around the planet of Inwit. Because of the force with which it smashed apart the shipyards, it devastated the Ramillies-class starfort, it filled the high orbit anchor all around the planet of Inwit with huge clouds of microshards of iron filaments and pieces of adamantium that essentially formed an impenetrable wall of micrometeorites all the way around the orbit of the planet Inwit. What had been the beginnings of a star-spanning empire was now trapped, locked onto their icy world behind the iron cage of micro-debris that tore through any vessels that tried to leave the planet's surface at a phenomenal rate, instantly destroying them and causing their drives to explode, just adding yet more carnage and debris to the cloud that would take decades to dissipate from around the orbit of Inwit. Inwit then was trapped. What would have been a great staging point for Rogel Dawn to grow and burgeon and learn the skills of conquest that would serve him well, now instead became a prison. A prison that was rapidly running out of supplies. Little is known in Imperial records as to what happened on the planet Inwit in the 2 decades it took for the debris cloud to dissipate sufficiently for other ships from the edges of their star-spanning empire to successfully make landfall on the planet's surface. What is known is this: the population of Inwit, at the point at which their other ships were finally able to return, was only a fraction, a single-figure percentage of what it had been before the crash of the iron cage. Rogel Dawn then grew up in hardship, he grew up in strife, in struggle, he grew up learning perhaps one vital lesson from his adoptive grandfather, that the end justifies the means, and that survival is its own goal. When the Emperor and his expeditionary fleets finally made contact with the population of Inwit some 2 decades later, yes, Rogel Dawn had successfully established dominion once more over the worlds that Inwit had begun to lay claim to, but the manner in which he had done so was brutal and cruel. It was more of a subjugation than anything else, not a colonization, not a welcoming into a star-spanning brotherhood, but a brutal conquest. But this was a tool the Emperor could use. When the 7th Legion then was reunited with their Primarch, they weren't sure what to expect. Several of their brother legions had already been reunited with their gene fathers, some of which had been cause for celebration, others perhaps slightly more awkward as they had to adjust to the culture that their gene fathers had been raised in. When they met Rogel of Clan Dawn for the first time, they were shocked by the sharp-edged, cold-eyed, white-haired figure that greeted them. He barely spoke to them for 2 months after they were reunited, perhaps offering terse commands or brief one-line orders. All of his communication focused on driving them to become the most effective fighting force that they could be. After those 2 months had passed, he called the Legion Masters to him and outlined to them all of the failings he had observed. Much as had happened on Inwit, the number of souls that entered that meeting of the minds was greater than the number that emerged, at least on their own 2 feet. The changes that Rogel Dawn outlined to the Masters of the 7th Legion were brutal. Planets would be offered a single choice: serve the Imperium or be brought to compliance on the point of a sword. Several of the Legion Masters argued against these changes, saying that diplomacy should be considered first, and that humanity's lost souls should be welcomed back into the fold, and only when all other diplomatic options had failed should warfare be the option. Rogaldorn slew them with his own bare hands, emerging from the meeting chamber, drenched to the elbow in gore. It was also after this moment that the 7th Legion were given their name, the Imperial Claws, an ice-cold fist that would grip worlds in their talons and force compliance upon them. Some called them by another name, the Emperor's Red Right Hand, and the Primarch earned an alternative cognomen, the Crimson Fist. Rogaldorn gathered a massive fleet, new ships that had been created for him by the manufactories of Mars, but also his existing vessels from his Inuit conqueror fleets, including the Phalanx, the remains of the Iron Cage Space Hulk and the twisted ruin of the Ramillies-class Starfort fused together into a new megastructure which would appear in orbit around worlds like the brutal clawed fist that became their Legion's symbol. The sight of it would invoke terror in any world that had heard what had come before during the Imperial Claw expeditionary fleets. Rogaldorn is famed to have remarked to one of the conquered worlds, "Do not look to us for kindness. Do not look to us for hope. We are not the kind children of a new age, but we are the rocks of its foundation." Each world that was conquered by his expeditionary fleets was garrisoned by a new fortress monastery of Imperial Claws. His legion grew to a huge size, and it was no surprise, therefore, that when Warmaster Sanguinius gathered those legions which had been referred to by Robert Gulliman as the Dauntless Few in orbit around Istvan, Dorn was more than willing to hear his brother out about the changes that needed to be brought within the Imperium and the overthrow of their father. Even now, 10,000 years after the end of the War of Blood, the thought of Imperial Claw vessels pouring out of the Eye of Terror to lay waste to Imperial worlds strikes terror in the hearts of sleeping children. I've painted up the first of my miniatures for my alternative history Chaos Legions, and here you can see it, the Imperial Claw. They took really nicely to the yellow and black scheme, actually. I can see why in the Dornian Heresy schemes it looks so cool. I've added the red right hand to the right shoulder pad, just to emphasise, again, the alternative name by which the Legion was known. I want to turn now from the corruption of a noble spirit to the restoration of nobility. In particular, I want to ask, what if Angron had been redeemed? What if he had been allowed to fight alongside his brother and sister gladiators, the freed slaves, on the ridge of Desh Alika, on the planet of Nuceria, instead of being whisked away by the Emperor and being forced to watch them die, broken and dispirited without him? It's something that within the 30k universe that's always seemed so odd to me. The Emperor was right there, he had the custodians and, you know, the World Eater, the Warhounds as they were, poised, ready to launch upon the planet. And he just pulled Angron out and walked away and left everything as it was. Perhaps it's just as planned. Who knows? I want to tell you a different story though. I want to raise an alternative version. The child that would become to be known as Angron then landed, much as happened in our world, on the planet of Nuceria. There he was found by wandering slavers, taken captive and taken to the capital city of Deshia, where he was sold into captivity and forced to fight as a gladiator. Famously, the very first time that he was pitched into the arena as merely a young teenager, the arena had in its centre a single mound. The arena was filled with him and 1,999 other gladiator slave wannabes. And then the arena began to fill with a caustic acid. The warriors were forced, against their will, to fight each other to that lone scrap of bare ground that would preserve them from an untimely and hideous death dissolving in that sort of viscous goop. In the world as we know it, Angron was the lone survivor. He was forced to kill against perhaps his nature, and it's said that on that occasion he shed a tear for the last time before hardening his heart and becoming the Red Angel of the Sands as we know. What if that had not been the case? What if he had found another way? What if he'd been allowed to retain some scrap of that noble spirit that was within him? That noble spirit that years later we would see him still mourning after everything he had done and everything he had seen, everything, the slaughter of his own gene-sons. He still returned to mourn on Nuceria before ascending to become the demon Primarch that we now have a really funky model of. What if in that arena that day he had found another way? Fighting, yes, back to back with other young warriors, he found himself in the end stood upon that patch of bare ground, but balanced on his shoulders, straining under the weight of them, testing his young, superhuman muscles to their limits, were two other warriors, Jubal and Hakon. Whilst the crowd initially booed and bayed for him to fight in order to pitch them into the acid, others slowly began to clap the feat of strength that required him to stand there. For over an hour, the crowd roared, waiting to see his strength give out, for them eventually to tumble from his shoulders and pitch into the acid, disproving his attempts at nobility fruitless. Hour after hour went by, and yet the young Primarch held those two warriors aloft, even after they themselves had begun to beg him to just kill them, rather than risk the loss of all three souls. Eventually it was deemed that it would be more interesting to keep the trio as a fighting act, a group act that could be brought back again and again and again. Thus it was that they became one of the central attractions of the arena, the Lords of the Red Sands, as they were known. And yes, Angron was still compelled to fight. Yes, he was still compelled to kill, and not by his own choice. But he retained that brotherhood, that friendship of those two souls he saved that day. And, as was inevitable, when the High Riders, the Lords and Masters of Nuceria and Dashia, thought to pitch the three warriors against each other, they refused. They laid down their arms and offered to be killed rather than have each other's blood upon their hands. So then, the cruelest trick that High Riders had in their arsenal, Angron had the red nails, an ancient and evil archaeotech device, hammered into his raw brain, supposedly sufficient to overcome any reticence that he might have, to turn him into nothing more than a mindless berserker. And once more he was pitched into the ring with Jubal, with Hakon, with Enemus, the older gladiator who had become a mentor to him. Some scrap of that nobility remained within Angron. Though he fought all three and maimed them, he did not kill them. At the end of the battle, despite the carnage, the blood that soaked him, they still lived. The High Riders were, in many respects, surprised, but also overjoyed, because this gave them new ways in which to torture this young, bold warrior for the amusements of the crowd. It was not to be. That night, Angron gathered up his two friends, his brothers, his father figure, and as many slaves, some 2,000 that he could free, slaughtered the guards and battled their way out of Dashia and onto the plains of Nuceria. Army after army was sent against them, but each one was destroyed by the might and brotherhood of this army of slaves, which in time came to be known as the Eaters of Cities, for each High Rider citadel that they brought low. Eventually, all the different citadels united their forces together to create an overwhelming force that would crush anything set against it, even the might of the by now full-grown Primarch. On the ridge of Deshalika, the Emperor found his lost son, standing in the encampment amongst those warriors he had come to call brother. The Emperor viewed the army that was approaching and knew it was too much even for a being as powerful as his newly found son to defeat. It was at that moment that the Emperor recognised within Angron that same facet of nobility that was present within his own spirit. And when the armies of the High Riders crested the ridge at dawn that day, they found themselves not facing a tired and outnumbered army of slaves, but the full might of the Adeptus Custodes. The carnage was unbelievable. The entirety of the High Rider forces were wiped out. The planet was brought to compliance in a single night. Angron freed every slave. Slavery became outlawed on Nicaea after that. And in fact, it is from there that he gained his name, the Breaker of Chains. He overturned society as a whole, creating a meritocracy. As many of his former brothers and sisters of the gladiators as he could, he drafted into his crusade fleet in whatever form. If they were young enough, they were granted the gene seed and became part of his newly recovered legion. If, in the case of Enemus and Hakon and Jubal, they were perhaps too old already to undergo the transformation, instead they were grafted juvenat treatments to renew and invigorate them, as many different technological advancements as he could to have them still fighting by his side. Jubal, despite his age, agreed to undertake the trials of aspiration and in time became Angron's equerry, although in truth a brother in arms within the Legion. The Legion had been known as the Warhounds, but Angron said that he would be no dog for no man. And the Emperor respected that. Much as Angron's warriors had been known as the Eater of Cities, he now decreed that they would be the Eater of Worlds, devouring the old ways of worlds that they encountered and bringing them into the light of the Imperial truth. The butcher's nails were removed by the Adeptus Mechanicus, who in fact were intrigued by the number of archaeotech devices that they were able to recover from Nuceria, albeit Angron made the Emperor swear that the butcher's nails would never be deployed, not even in the lowest soldier caste or penal legionnaire. No slaves, he said. We shall make an Imperium of free men. World after world were brought then into compliance by the World Eaters, each one given the opportunity to turn away from whatever way in which they had been living and embrace the Imperial truth. And only then, if it was denied, would Angron unleash his legion and break the chains that bound the citizens there, whether they were chains of lies or servitude, Xenos enslavement. Wherever he went, he left behind free and enlightened worlds. Statues were raised in his honour on each planet that he had bestowed this compliance upon, although he was heard to remark that he had little interest in such things. Monuments are dust, he said. Tales, merely words to be forgotten. But honour is forever. When the time came, he stood on the walls of the Emperor's palace, defending the doors of the Eternity Gate against the ravening hordes of the Blood Angels, the Ultramarines, the Raven Guard, the White Scars. He fought them all, stemming the tide of 5 legions worth of traitors, with his brothers Jubal and Hakon still by his side. Hakon was the first to fall, Jubal an hour later, and still Angron fought on. When the battle was over, and the Emperor had been installed upon the Golden Throne, Angron was found still living under a pile of enemies nearly 500 metres high. All of his wounds to the front. After the War of Blood was over, and the Primarch Horus urged the breaking of the legions into chapters, so that no one soldier could ever command the might that the War Master Sanguinius had commanded, Angron complied, and one of the first chapters that were founded gave honour to the legion that had fought by his side all those years ago on Nuceria, the Warhounds chapter. That's what I've painted up here. This is my warrior from the Warhounds chapter. I'm going to say now this is the only Warhound I will be painting. freehanding the chapter symbol on the shoulder pad was a pain in the bum. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this. This was something that's been dwelling in my brain for a while. I'm going to do a few more of these. I'm certainly enjoying painting future models for this. And again, if you follow me on Twitter or on Blue Sky or Instagram, you'll see whatever progress I'm making there, and it'll give you an idea of what we can expect in future videos. If you'd like to take part, if this has filled you with enthusiasm and you'd like to paint up some models, like I said, you can share them with me there, and if they're really cool, then I'll share them in future videos. But I've made a promise, anybody who is on my Patreon, if you share models with me there, if you follow me on Patreon, then I will guaranteed include those in future videos. Cool, alright, well, thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. I will catch you next time. Bye for now.